Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Today, physicist Wal Thornhill concludes his three-part presentation on the early science results from NASA's Juno mission to the gas giant Jupiter. As previously noted, like countless other recent space discoveries, the mission findings are challenging not only long-held assumptions about Jupiter, but also consensus theories of planet and star formation and the history of our solar system. On the question of Jupiter's internal structure and composition, Thornhill offered the provocative thesis that Jupiter is hollow. In this episode, Thornhill presents his predictions for forthcoming Juno revelations, including the mystery of what lies beneath the planet's great red spot. We begin with some further explanation of electrogravity.
Of course, the idea of a hollow Earth with an inner surface like a geode is a formidable challenge to our entrenched belief that the Earth has a dense core. It's a belief that can only be overcome by explanation, by demonstration, and by a willingness to consider the evidence. Consider for a moment that the electrogravity model presented here applies equally to any spinning object, where the heavy nuclei in each atom are offset radially from the spin axis to form tiny radial electric dipoles. This is the simple reason why inertial mass is equivalent to gravitational mass. The centrifugal force is not a fictitious or pseudo force, it's identical to gravity. It's the reason why a spinning space station like the one famously modelled in Stanley Kubrick's landmark film A Space Odyssey produces its own gravity. This raises the question how someone in the space station knows they are spinning, only by looking out of a window and seeing the stars sweep past. The so-called fixed stars are the reference standard for all motion in the electric universe, because the electric force of gravity connects all matter in the universe, practically in real time. That's why gyros are used for inertial navigation, because they tend to lock themselves gravitationally to the matter in the rest of the universe. Think about it. In a universe of countless negatively polarized stars and planets repelling each other, a gyro has a positively polarized rim, which is attracted to all of those celestial bodies. Sadly, those who have demonstrated what seem to be anti-gravity effects of gyros have not had any useful understanding of gravity from physicists to explain what they were observing. Most significant was Professor Eric Laithwaite's 1974-75 Royal Institution's Christmas lecture, finally posted online in December 2013, which I recommend watching. As for willingness to consider eyewitness evidence, scientists at the Royal Institution behaved predictably by refusing to broadcast the remarkable lecture on the grounds, as the Royal Institution website says, and I quote, "Laithwaite appears to have used various engineering approximations in his calculations on the behaviour of gyroscopes, and when told by professional mathematicians that once the calculations were done rigorously, there was no discrepancy, he refused to believe them. These are the same professional mathematicians who can't define mass or energy in terms of matter and have no sensible model of the real nature of gravity." Laithwaite was only one of three people since 1945 to deliver more than one series of the Royal Institution's Christmas lectures. His first series was the first to be televised on the new BBC Two channel. Back to Jupiter's origin and composition. Decades ago, the plasma cosmologist and Nobel Prize-winning plasma physicist Hans Alfvén predicted that stars would be formed along Birkeland current filaments inside molecular clouds. He famously said, "Gravitational systems are the ashes of former electrical systems." Infrared space telescopes have recently confirmed this, but no acknowledgement has been forthcoming from settled astrophysics because of their taboo against electricity in space. The electric universe simply adds that both stars and planets are formed in the same event. The cosmic lightning characteristically snakes about and is observed to toss the newly formed bodies out laterally, but collisions are avoided by repulsive gravity. The thousands of crazy exoplanetary systems are simply explained by the inward gravitational pressure of all other bodies in the universe against the repulsive gravitational force of the nearest dominant body. Hot Jupiters orbiting their star closely is not a puzzle when we get rid of the gravitational accretion and merger by collision myth. On the question of the composition of Jupiter, plasma physicists have shown that Birkeland currents draw the heavy elements towards the centres of celestial bodies, and the gases form their atmospheres, with hydrogen and helium outermost. So the composition of Jupiter can't be assessed from its atmosphere. Jupiter is not mostly hydrogen and helium. All of the issues raised mean Jupiter is a solid shell composed of heavy elements. It will have structure both on its external and internal surfaces. Jupiter is not, as Scott said of the simplistic standard model, boring and uniform inside. Anywhere you look will not look the same. So let's return to NASA's teleconference. Scott Bolton, Juno principal investigator, said, "There are motions deep inside Jupiter that people hadn't anticipated, and the gravity field is consistent with that. What we were really looking for was a core, whether there was a compact core or no core, and instead what we found was that it looks really fuzzy. There may be a core there, and it may be very big, and it may be partially dissolved. That came as a big surprise to us, that there was no core. These mysteries extended to our magnetic field experiment." Jack Connolly, Juno deputy principal investigator, said, "On Earth, the compass doesn't deviate much from the north-south direction. On Jupiter, the magnetic field was both stronger than we expected, where we expected it to be strong, and it was weaker than we expected, where we expected it to be weak. There are small spatial variations which indicate we may be very close to the source, so it may be above the metallic hydrogen and may operate in the molecular hydrogen envelope. The electrogravity model of hollow celestial objects removes any idea of planetary magnetic fields being generated by internal dynamos. That hypothesis has never been able to successfully model the complexity and variety of planetary magnetic fields found in the solar system. It doesn't work for the sun either. As Faraday found, magnetic fields are intimately associated with electric currents, but electrogravity is also associated with magnetism. Both forces have the same origin in the distortion of protons and electrons. The Earth shows a connection between the two forces, which requires a fundamental reinterpretation. The simplest explanation for a dipole magnetic field aligned roughly with the axis of rotation of a planet is that the planet carries a surface charge which constitutes a current. This was considered for the origin of the Earth's field, but it was rejected because the electric current of 10 to the 9 amperes required seemed too high, because the charge it implied would generate a tremendously strong electric field at the Earth's surface, which doesn't exist. However, there is a clear air electric field of about 100 volts per metre. The problem with this argument is that to measure voltage requires a reference, and the Earth or ground is considered our reference voltage. And it is clear that the Earth has plenty of electrons to carry the return current of our power networks. But the fundamental error comes from the belief that stars and planets can be considered electrically neutral in space plasma. This has been proven incorrect in the case of the Sun, where numerous electrical double layers or plasma sheaths have been found in the interplanetary plasma that reduce the electric field between them. The Earth has plasma sheaths in the ionosphere and magnetosphere which do the same thing. So the 100 volts per metre measured in the lower atmosphere doesn't give a true picture of the charge on the Earth. Venus's lack of a magnetic field could be down to its ultra-slow rotation, but it leaves Uranus and Neptune's oddly offset magnetic fields unanswered. It seems more probable that the cool solid shells of planets retain some of their nascent magnetic fields when the ambient field of their birthing Birkeland current was at its peak. Planetary rotation can also be understood as an imprint of the rotating Birkeland current filament. The slow retrograde rotation of Venus, its heat and lack of a magnetic field, argues for a different, recent birth. The global myths of Venus as the archetypal comet match this idea and introduce an alternative birth process for smaller rocky planets and moons by a process of electrogravitic expulsion from a much larger body. This proposal makes sense of the large numbers of satellites of the gas giants and the spectacular icy rings of Saturn, which are of very recent origin. Finally, a word about Jupiter's great red spot. Its continued presence for centuries is another argument for a solid body beneath the clouds. Its giant tornadic form is that of a continuous electrical discharge vortex from an elevated surface feature acting like a lightning rod. which could be the birth scar of one of Jupiter's moons. The Juno spacecraft is due to observe the Great Red Spot closely on its next close encounter with Jupiter, where I expect even greater gravitational and electromagnetic anomalies to be found associated with the spot.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part one of this presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill began his analysis of the extraordinary revelations from NASA's Juno mission to the gas giant Jupiter. Like every other recent space mission, what scientists are finding is not what they expected. In the previous episode, Thornhill focused on Jupiter's remarkable electrified atmosphere, an environment that astonished astronomers in 1994 when it was, quote, probed by the natural intruder, the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9. Today, Thornhill will explore the internal composition and dynamics of the gas giant, already a source of major surprise for NASA investigators. Consensus scientific theory states that Jupiter's incredibly powerful magnetic field is powered by a mysterious internal dynamo. But nothing that the Juno mission has discovered supports this hypothesis. As principal investigator Scott Bolton stated, "I didn't expect all the theories to be wrong, but there's motion going on in the planet we did not anticipate. How did Jupiter form, and what is it composed of down to its core?" Wal Thornhill explains the differences between the theoretical predictions of the electric universe and those of standard astronomical theory.
In my first space news about the first science from Juno at Jupiter, I looked at Jupiter's atmosphere, comparing Juno's findings with the earlier Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet fragments encounter with the giant planet. In this second part, I looked deeper inside Jupiter and showed just how different Jupiter looks in the electric universe model compared to the children's tale we have been taught. The comparison is quite confronting. Returning to the teleconference, Scott Bolton, Juno principal investigator, showed a diagram of what Jupiter's interior might look like. It represents what most scientists believed before Juno got there. Scott said, and I paraphrase a little, "We have three different techniques to look into Jupiter. One is the gravity field, which sees all the way down to the bottom, where you see an ice rock core, and you're looking at 40 million times the atmospheric pressure at sea level on Earth. We have a magnetic field experiment that looks into that bluish region that's called metallic hydrogen. And that's where the hydrogen is squeezed so much and the temperature is such that it's like a liquid metallic hydrogen. And we believe somewhere in there, maybe the magnetic field gets created, or maybe above that where there's enough charged particles. But the magnetic field penetrates into that. The upper meteorological layer is the atmosphere, which is actually quite deep. We've never seen that before Juno's microwave radiometer. So we have these three ways to look into Jupiter. The top part is done with the microwaves, the middle part is done with the magnetic field, and then the gravity looks all the way down to the center. The electric universe model doesn't accept the story of how Jupiter was formed, and it questions two of the three ways used to look inside Jupiter. To put it bluntly, settled science doesn't understand how stars and planets are formed and has no explanation for the origin of magnetism or gravity. So everything below Jupiter's atmosphere will be misinterpreted. The electric universe has the outstanding and crucial advantage of a real physical model.
You should just follow me around. There's a plasma cosmology versus the Big Bang mythology debate every day if you're next to me.
Within each other.
You guys know me. I don't go to the echo chambers. I go to the where the debate is.
It will be difficult for those who think.
Well, I also go to the echo chambers. You need a little bit of that every once in a while, but I don't stay there.
Warped by heavy objects placed upon it. The rubber sheet is a fanciful two-dimensional representation of three-dimensional space.
Yeah, Debbie's
Nothing
right.
physically exists in two dimensions. Yet the sun and earth are shown in 3 dimensions as spheres. They should be shown as circles on the sheet.
I finally got some friggin' status quo sustainers, I call them. Status quo sustainers. To admit that the articles and the topics that I was talking about were coming from NASA, and they were not pseudoscience after 2.5 years of being, you know, basically trolled every time I show up somewhere. It's like, there's the idiot who thinks that the electric universe is real. And doing all this without ever listening to a fucking word I'm saying with any kind of real, listening, any kind of, they're just trying to formulate arguments, misrepresent everything I'm saying before I could even finish my sentences. And then why am I so mad? Why are you so mad? It's hella funny. But yeah, that guy Gus, he was like, you fucking idiot, you always full of shit. Blah, 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 blah. Finally, like on a whole panel full of his little buddies, they had to see that Gus was actually the idiot. And they all joined in with that for 2 years, jumping all over my shit with Gus, just, because he's crazy, because he mentions vaccines are bad for you. He must be stupid. Like, they read about shit in a fucking magazine that they're good for you somewhere, and then they think, oh, wow, and they don't know anything about any of the CDC cover-ups or the FDA or the EPA or any of the government cover-ups that cover up all the things from the malfeasance and the omitted data from safety studies from biotech firms to pharmaceutical companies alike. So, I mean, you want to see court dates? You want to see, oh, no, you're crazy, you're an idiot. That's okay. But I return for the abuse, so that's, because eventually I'm going to keep on chipping away at your ignorance until one day you're not so ignorant. But yeah. How the hell's everybody doing today? Good, good. Yeah, I usually fire this kind of thing up just so that you guys have, where I'm at. You can come say hello, and we're all, anything new can be brought to the table during this time, or anytime one of those status quo sustainers want to show up and ever try and have a discussion about any of the stuff that they're so strong-willed about when I'm at their hangouts, but they don't ever come over to my hangouts to show their strong will. You know what I mean? And I think because they know better. And it's sad. It's like a fake strong man. You know what I mean? Like, I'm the strong man as long as nobody ever contends with me. It's like, okay, whatever. I'll contend with you only on my own ring with all the trapdoors, and I know where they are. Basically, metaphor for rude people to interrupt and confuse your line of thought in the middle of the process continuously. I don't need much help doing that. Confuse myself continuously. Yeah, I just missed you guys. Wanted to say hey. So hey. What's up? Let's see. What's inside Jupiter? I thought this was a really good video. Oh, I didn't add it to any of my... I forgot.
Anywhere. Think about it. So how does the electric universe explain gravity? Uncommon sense suggests the origin of gravity is to be found in the particles that make up a celestial body. So the electric universe proposes both the proton and the electron have internal structure like the atom and are composed of smaller charged particles in orbit. The proton and electron are like tiny atoms, but with a net charge, positive and negative respectively. And like atoms, the protons and electrons will distort in an electric field and align with their neighbours like tiny magnets to form daisy-chained electric dipoles. That's the origin of gravity inside a weighty body. It explains the puzzling extreme weakness of gravity, since it originates almost entirely in the heavy atomic nuclei, which are electrically shielded inside atoms. This model also explains the origin of the much stronger magnetic force, where the electron or proton is free to be accelerated in an unshielded electric field. The consequences of the electric universe model of electrogravity are profound for Jupiter and may explain the unexpected results from Juno. As we know, gravity can't be shielded, so the heavy positively charged nucleus in each atom is displaced radially towards the centre of Jupiter. This means that atoms to some depth in Jupiter will have a positive electric pole facing the centre of the planet and a negative electric pole facing outwards to the rest of the universe. Jupiter appears as a negative gravitational sphere to the rest of the universe. Gravity throughout the universe is a repulsive force. However, the Juno spacecraft is orbiting within Jupiter's gravitational sphere of influence and has an induced gravitational dipole, which attracts the spacecraft like an iron filing to a magnet. That's the effect we experience on Earth and call gravity. Scientists for centuries have assumed that they can simply extrapolate our experience of attraction to the Earth throughout the universe, despite the fact that galaxies don't move in support of this belief. So the inside of Jupiter is unlike anything ever contemplated by Newtonian physics. Jupiter's gravity is almost 2.5 times stronger than that of the Earth. So internally, at some depth, there will be a strong repulsive force due to the positive gravitational poles facing inwards, which can hold a spherical shell of matter stably in place. Jupiter is hollow and doesn't have a core of liquid metallic hydrogen. Of course, the same argument for hollowness holds for the Earth and all other celestial bodies. So it's significant that a number of leading scholars in the past have considered this possibility. Today, the subject is considered crackpot and taboo by settled science. But science generally advances through paradigm shifts initiated by individuals who are not subject to science's taboos. The small voice at the back of the crowd crying, "The emperors have no clothes." A recent independent feasibility study by a South African, Jan Lamprecht, into the seismology expected of a hollow Earth, found that it fits the detailed observations of seismology without all of the ad hoc assumptions and mysteries of the standard model of the Earth, involving Newton's law and an inner and outer core. Lamprecht asks, is there anything in seismology which could be a misinterpretation of a hollow cavity? The answer is yes. The Earth's outer core could easily be a cavity. He argues the Earth is cool and brittle deep down to a depth of 700 kilometres because many deep quakes have been recorded at that depth. In the standard Earth model, the rocks should be hot, dense and plastic beyond a depth of 150 kilometres and incapable of generating earthquakes. What no scientist on Earth is willing to accept is that maybe gravity doesn't work in the way they think it does, says Lamprecht. An even more compelling argument for a hollow Earth is that the inner surface has features more pronounced seismically than those at the surface. Of course, planetary scientists have an immediate objection to a hollow Earth because, based on its gravitational mass, the Earth theoretically must have a dense core. But this exposes another serious problem in basic physics: the confusion of mass, which is a property of matter, with the quantity of matter. Unbelievable as it may seem, physics has no definition of mass in terms of matter. And because both words begin with the letter M, does not make them mathematically equivalent, because we know from E equals mc squared that mass is an energetic variable, while the amount of matter remains fixed. Electrogravity involves a radial electric field in the Earth's matter, which is a form of stored energy, like a capacitor. Changing the electric charge on the Earth can change the Earth's mass and gravity. This has been shown by Earth's rotational glitches when hit by massive storms of charged particles from the Sun. It also means that it is impossible to figure out the composition of the Earth or Jupiter or any other celestial body by simply measuring its gravity and applying an invalid model of their interiors. Apollo 12 placed the first seismometer on another world. On the 20th of November 1969, the Apollo 12 lunar module was sent crashing into the moon's surface to ensure some kind of seismic result because it was thought the moon should be seismically dead. The moon's behaviour was totally unexpected. It rang like a bell for an hour. Scientists were stunned at the time. How often do we hear this? The trace shown here was recorded by the seismometers left behind on the surface. The simplest interpretation suggests the moon is hollow. Of course, this was beyond belief, so the Earth model was applied and massaged to appear to accommodate this stunning failure of expectations. Since then, Apollo seismic observations discovered that the moon is seismically active with more than 13,000 seismic events recorded. The most frequently observed are deep moonquakes at 800 to 1,200 kilometres depth in the moon. Though intensive studies have been carried out for decades, why and how deep moonquakes occur are remaining mysteries, says one expert. That sounds familiar.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. At the forthcoming Thunderbolts Project Conference, EU 2017, Future Science in Phoenix, Arizona, experts from a variety of disciplines will present their unique contributions to the electric universe cosmology. More and more inquirers are exploring this cosmology to find solutions to lingering scientific puzzles, including such questions as what is matter? Why does matter have mass? Or how does matter have energy? Today, this question is being explored by author and teacher Peter Modell, whose book Making Sense presents a view on the interaction between the mind and the world. In Phoenix, within the context of the electric universe, Peter will offer a fresh perspective on the age-old question, what can matter be?
In the context of the EU, mass and matter are clearly distinguished. Wallace Thornhill has offered a full description of mass. This leaves the question, what then can matter be? Here lies the challenge. There are no ready-made answers to draw from, and responses to the question invariably leave unexplored enigma. In the case of mass, we measure how an object responds to forces acting on it. Matter answers a different question. What is it that responds in this way? Matter raises the ontological question. Mass doesn't. To ask about matter is to question the physical nature of the world, a vintage question with a long history. In Greek philosophy, we find the view that matter necessarily appears together with form, that is, with the characteristics that define it, such as shape, color, and more. This coupling of matter with form is known in reference to Aristotle's philosophy as hylomorphism. It implies that matter on its own, though of metaphysical interest, cannot appear in the manifest world. The coupling of matter and form intertwines content with perception and points to the fact that to understand a material object, we must take account of the act of perception. This is the trail we will now follow. When asking what is matter, what are we actually looking for? Not earth, water, air, fire, nor chemical formulae, but the question goes further than this. Plants, rocks, buildings, planets, galaxies, what is the substance they have in common, the matter of all the material things I observe? This question brings a typical response, and you know it. The question, what is it? We begin taking objects apart to find what they are composed of. For instance, asking, what's a forest? The answer will be trees. And what's a tree? Well, branches, trunk, roots. And again, what are these? Well, cells. And what's a cell? Molecules. And this continues down little subatomic particles, where very likely the question gets lost in quantum uncertainties. This reductionist trail has proven hauntingly attractive, and in moving to the ever more minute, there's a sense of closing in on the prey. It's intoxicating for some to feel they're reducing the gap between the sought-for object and its material manifestation. But this advance towards the goal, as we'll see, is merely an illusion. What is formed in the mind has been weaned from its source in being. This break remains, whatever scale is chosen. Let's move through this step by step. When taking apart an object to find out what it is, the initial object is forgotten and replaced by its components. We no longer speak of a forest, but of a tree. Not of trees, but of a cell. Not of cells, but of a molecule, and so forth. By moving to successively smaller scales in order to find what an object is made of, we are in fact running away from the question. There comes the surprise of realizing that components do not make an object what it is. It is through a global view from the outside, so to speak, that everything becomes what it is. There's a reason why it's so that's not often told, and it's important to know. When you hear the word forest, or you see one, a wealth of meaning comes to you spontaneously in a moment. Forest can conjure in your mind shade, beauty, sense of joy, fear, getting lost, bears, picnics, anthills, wild berries, escape, and so forth, the unending list, interlocking, spreading meanings. Of course, you don't think through a list like this. If it were conscious, our mind would be so cluttered we couldn't make any sense of anything. The features and feelings like those mentioned are present in the meaning you spontaneously have for forest. To achieve this meaning, there's no process of calculation, and there is no algorithm. Instead, in an instant that never registers in our conscious minds, a vast array of related information and feelings are assembled and integrated to become a single something, the perceived object. This happens all the time. There's a square drawn on a page, and in a flash, see it's a square. However, to do so means you integrated the ratios between the lines and angles and where they meet. Physically, something similar is happening. Take, for an example, vision. Light intensities impinging on the retinal cells are transformed into electric pulses that reach the visual cortex. To the extent I perceive anything, surely it should be a shower of electrical impulses, a sort of visual noise. But no, the sequence of transmitted pulses became a unitary object, as for example, the bird I'm looking at. How does this happen? At a moment entirely out of consciousness, the sequence pulses are integrated to become the fully formed object I perceive. In the blink of an eye, many became one, and a unit of meaning was delivered at the doorstep of consciousness. What came before is impossible to determine. This shows the transformation from the unknowable to the known. Strange, isn't it, how this momentous act is so easily ignored? Our topic is matter, and of course it is matter we're talking of. The material object we identify has been defined through an act of integration, and therefore holds no hidden content within it. But wait, if matter itself were to manifest, size would be irrelevant, and it could be gloriously macroscopic. Now, in the same way that a physical object has a center of mass that is not formed from anything that is present at that position, so the object we perceive with the meaning we attribute it is not built up from a specific content, but through the integration that delivers the object to our conscious minds. And this fact leads to a further realization: in the act of perceiving, we are not passive onlookers. Instead, we have an active role in bringing all we perceive to manifest as it does. A deeper understanding would need to go beyond the mind's activity. It would reach into the precognitive encounter with whatever it is that generates all we recognize as material objects. There, presence is shared, and experiencer and experienced are not separate. To reach such a place, we will need to loosen the hylomorphic Gordian knot that binds matter to form. Philosopher and physicist have different approaches when it comes to this, but they complement one another. Actually, the problem became insoluble when one looked for the kernel of reality in matter. Isn't this that trapped our thinking into gravity-dominated cosmology? You see, gravity was thought to come from matter, and therefore a universe based on gravity preserved the stature of matter. With the EU model, all this changes. Electricity, in assuming the dominant cosmological role, releases gravity from its presumed quantitative dependence on matter. Future science can be different. And we can ask afresh this August, what can matter be?
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe,
I bet you he's going to tell you it's magnetism.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. At the forthcoming Thunderbolts Project Conference, EU 2017, Future Science in Phoenix, Arizona, experts in a variety of disciplines will present groundbreaking evidence for the role of electricity in nature. In the Electric Universe community, many contributors have come from a background in engineering, where applied technologies and industrial processes may provide intriguing analogs for natural phenomena. One of these speakers will be Garrett Hill, the CTO of the company Thrivaltech, where he and his team develop plasma technologies for various applications, including the internal combustion engine, with the goal of providing the world with more effective emissions control solutions. We asked Garrett to introduce himself and to explain what has drawn him to the Electric Universe community.
My background started out in the performance automotive sector, where I was designing, building, and racing vehicles. And I developed a lot of skills there, but none that immediately seemed to pertain to this concept of an electric universe, besides like capacitive discharge spark plugs, right? So that you get more bang for your buck in the cylinder. And after I stopped working in that sector, I immediately jumped into atmospheric research and was doing some atmospheric research in Colorado, and quickly realized that there was a lot of electrical activity going on in the eastern part of Colorado, as well as there's Tornado Alley, which is close to that zone. And that was really exciting because I had met up with a crew who was sort of veterans in chasing storms and capturing data. I jumped on board and we ended up chasing a tornado through about 3 states, caught up with it. This is in 2009 in Wyoming, and got up close and personal with an F2 tornado and actually went inside the tornado. And I got a real intimate interaction with the storm, the balance of all of these forces, these electrical discharges that were happening inside of the clouds, and the anvil that was sort of leading the storm in close proximity to the tornado and all the mesocyclones that were surrounding the zone. And after I came out of that tornado, it was really clear that there was an immense amount of knowledge to be had by
Oh, okay. I'm stupid. everything backwards, you know? Their playlists are backwards.
Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A new scientific study could radically change our view of the sun. It seems that the sun is not behaving as it should. Scientists have recently created what they call an MRI of the sun's interior plasma motions. For decades, solar physicists have believed that at the sun's core is a superheated thermonuclear reaction. This theory requires a massive transport of thermal energy to the sun's surface through convection. But the results of this study indicate a virtual absence of convection, just 1% of what a thermonuclear core would require. How does this affect our understanding of the sun?
The thermonuclear model requires several things to be going on, which don't appear to be going on. One is there's supposed to be a radiative zone inside the sun, and then above that, a convective zone. And of course, the radiative zone is purely speculative. It's only required by the model. There's no evidence for it. And the convective zone is also speculative, based on the granulation that's seen on the surface of the sun. That was interpreted as being the tops of convection cells. But the fact that they've discovered very little convection means that both the theory of the granulation, the theory of the generation of magnetic field, and the theory of transfer of energy from the center of the sun, all of these are in peril. And I would say that what we're seeing is the demise of the standard model of the sun.
The absence of the expected convection is just the latest in a long string of surprises for solar physicists.
There are many anomalies. In fact, the very magnetic fields above the sun and the very hot corona, none of these have been properly explained. There's been a lot of arm waving about energy is somehow transferred from inside the sun to the outside without affecting the photosphere, because this is what's required. But this is a really weird kind of model where you've got 16 million degrees on one side of the photosphere and tens of millions of degrees up in the corona. And sitting in the middle is a 5,000 to 6,000 degree photosphere. And it's required very or sort of extreme speculation as to how you would ever get that energy out of the sun. And there's been no satisfactory answer.
Thornhill points to a different model of the sun, which relies on the principles of plasma physics.
Well, the electric sun is energy received from outside the sun in the form of an electric current lighting up the ionosphere of a body, which is no different to any of the other bodies in the solar system, only it may be much larger. And so we're looking at the top of the very top of the atmosphere, like the ionosphere of a body.
My title is Visual Intuition and the Ancient Sky. My subtitle, Complexity Theory and Plasma Cosmology. I'm going to beg the graces of those who know more about complexity theory and cellular automata than I do, and they will help us through this, the most difficult part of my presentation. This is the defining image, the squatter man. We've seen him before, we'll see him again. These are more familiar images to you already. The squatter man in petroglyphs. This is Kayenta, a defining image that will come up later. We'll go all around the world and more in Arizona. So you see how global, and this is hard to see, but it's in the state we're in. If anyone knows who drew this, I'd be deeply appreciative. I came across it through Parat Images on Google, which led me to ancientdestructions.com. We see here, marvelously, we see here Stone Age man and woman gazing at squatter man configuration in the sky, after having made a petroglyph about it. Likewise, what is above it in the polar configuration, after having made another petroglyph of it. So I'm going to tantalize you with something very strange. This will be the subject of my exposition of the work of Stephen Wolfram, author of A New Kind of Science, 2002. And it's very strange, isn't it? I will go over it later, but I just want you to look at this image, particularly at this. Just hold that image. My thesis. Complexity theory is a powerful natural ally to plasma cosmology. Both tell us that in reconstructing the sequence of events in the ancient sky, we have to imagine watching images unfold in a sequence, a story. The events and images are often too complex to be predictable. Both tell us that visual intuition will be an indispensable guide and even in many cases, a form of proof. We'll see if I make this thesis clear to you or not. Galileo looking rather feisty, don't you think? Now, Mel Atchison gave us the popular version of Galileo's famous statement. The book of nature is written in mathematics. Since that simplification, which we are more familiar with than the original, is not really the whole of what Galileo said in one splendid long sentence of Italian prose, I'll read you a translation of that sentence. Nature does not appear in it, but philosophy and the universe do. Philosophy is written in that great book which ever is before our eyes. I mean the universe. But we cannot understand it if we do not first learn the language and grasp the symbols in which it is written. The book is written in mathematical language, and the symbols are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without whose help it is impossible to comprehend a single word of it, without which one wanders in vain through a dark labyrinth. 1623, Il Saggiatore, the Essayer. Now, my theme will be partly the mathematics bashing, which we've already seen. However, I want to come back to Galileo in the end and show him to be a good guy too, all right? But for the moment, let us note that for him, mathematics meant geometry, indeed, classical Euclidean geometry. And he is certainly emphatic. Without knowing that geometry, you can't read a single word in the book of nature. That does seem to be excessive. Still, we'll come back to him as a good guy. Now here is Stephen Wolfram. And here is the first statement about how mathematics can be superseded, complemented, augmented, replaced, various possibilities by other procedures which require more visual intuition. This and many subsequent quotes are taken from an excellent thing online, Quick Takes on Some Ideas and Discoveries in a New Kind of Science,
It just seems like
written by
sense.
Wolfram. His book, 846 pages with 300 pages of fine print footnotes, is perhaps complex, but he knows the relation of simplicity to complexity, and on his various website pages, he'll give you the whole book in one single page summary, and he'll give you quick takes. Here's a quick take. He will make the very quick take and then explain it. Mathematical equations do not capture many of nature's most essential mechanisms. For more than 3 centuries, we're talking Galileo to now, mathematical equations and methods such as calculus have been taken as the foundation for the exact sciences. There have been many profound successes, but a great many important and obvious phenomena in nature remain unexplained, especially ones where more complex forms or behavior are observed. Now, two other familiar faces, more familiar than Wolfram's perhaps. Talbot and Thornhill weighing in on mathematics. Astrophysicists are not trained in electrodynamics or plasma discharge phenomena. Such things would render their gravitational models obsolete. They continue to rely on gas and magnetized fluid physics that is mathematically well-mannered. Uncritical application of mathematical models will lead to whimsical and unstable descriptions of nature. So, Wolfram's exposition of his use of cellular automata and his claim that through them we can also study similar phenomena in nature is what I will now explore in the most technical part of my presentation. So, here is a cellular automaton, and here is the progression of it, and I'm going to explain both images carefully. But first, the quote. Cellular automata are examples of simple programs that work by having the color of each cell in successive rows be determined by the same simple rule. So let's see the example. Here is the second cell in a checkerboard like this, in which the top line is, as it were, the initial state, and each line lower down is a subsequent state evolution of the cellular automaton. The evolution is contingent on the rules for each of these 8 boxes. Let's look at this one. If the cell, the central cell, is white and flanked by both whites, left and right, then in the next stage it will be white. If white but flanked by white on the left and black on the right, then black, and so forth with each of these evolutions. Now, Wolfram took 255 cellular automata of this kind. All of them have rules exactly as simple as each other, and they lead to very different kinds of developments as you go from stage to stage, from horizontal level to horizontal level down the checkerboard. With the rules above, a simple pattern is produced. Here is the simple pattern evolving by these rules. Based on chapter 2, the crucial experiment in a new kind of science, these images of cellular automata illustrate some of the core discoveries of MKS. And I add the 2 images above are rule 90 in Wolfram's set of 255 rules. I hope you fasten your seatbelt, because if this page is unclear, it will only get more complex, all right? But we perhaps will have time for questions. Rule 90 produces an intricate yet ultimately regular pattern. Look at this. Isn't that lovely? It's a pattern. It's in fact fractal too, the beauty of fractals. That's rule 90. A different rule, just as simple, producing a different pattern, which is getting on the left striated into bands, and on the right complex, bewildering. Wolfram has discovered and argues in a new kind of science that certain simple rules can produce patterns and behavior of immense complexity. Above is rule 30. It soon becomes complex above, and at 100 steps, it appears very complex indeed below. Can you see how?
Well, that's exactly the idea that we're using to express how gravity could be a modality of, dielectric acceleration. It's exactly that meaning right there. It's of the same simple pattern. It's just a different wave of the pattern. So it's behaving differently. It's, but it's of the same so-called what you would call force, but it's not, you know what I mean?
Striated bands are here, but this is at a random, isn't it? Well, it only gets worse.
That would, on the left, you would see coherency, magnetism, and on the left, you'd see gravity, incoherent magnetism of the same material. Basically, it's the same electric dynamic, creating a different pattern from the same pattern of more complexity.
Worse, if for you randomness is bad. At 1,000 steps, rule 30, pardon typo, appears to have patterns in the bands on the left and to be random to the right of those bands. If one started with only one step 1,000, here, one could not reconstruct the simple rule that generated it. One would not guess that the rule was simple. And to look ahead to the grand thesis, suppose that this whole evolution is like some phenomenon in nature which you observe part of. So say you observe only this part, like there, that's all you can see. Would you ever be able to reconstruct the simple rule that generated it? Would you be able to guess that the rules that generated it were simple? Rule 10 is in a different category of rules from those generating either tandem or randomness. There's rule 110. As it evolves, a complex pattern emerges on the right and continues to morph into similar patterns of different shapes, none quite the same as the pattern preceding it. A mysterious statement, which I'm about to illustrate. Here is its elementary rule, 110. Here is the opening sequence of steps. So far, it's just not so clear what's going to happen, is it? But this is the image I began with and asked you to hold that image. Rule 10 at 250 steps. I would gladly have given you it at 1,000 steps, but it seemed a bit too much memory. So we have the patterning of striations. We have here something that seems to be monochrome, one of the possibilities. He sorted cellular automata when he was a boy wonder in his 20s into 4 categories. When they turn random, when they turn monochrome, when they turn patterned, when they turn random, and when they turn what he calls complex. This evolution is visibly something that in which each phase of it resembles earlier phases, but is not the same. It's what I call the Canadian phenomenon. You look similar, but somehow different. So can you see that our eye sees this as a pattern? Our eye sees this as a pattern. This pattern resembles that, but is neither the same scale nor precisely the same shape. So we could watch this unfold a long time, perhaps forever, and would still not be able to predict the patterns in advance. That is the essential point of his take on the word complexity. Now, we've gotten through the worst and most technical part. What I shall now do is juxtapose statements from a new kind of science, taking Stephen Wolfram as a case among many fine laborers in complexity theory. I don't want to make him the sole star. That's been a problem with his reception, and I'm not interested in that problem. But many complexity theory people would make similar statements. Likewise, I'm going to take Talbot and Thornhill as representative of many fine workers and quite distinctive in their own contribution. And I'm going to juxtapose statements on a few topics: mathematics, complexity, and time. So you can see how they might be powerful natural allies, because there are similar views on these topics and others. Views on mathematics for the new kind of science. Thinking in terms of programs rather than equations opens up a new kind of science. Mathematical equations correspond to particular kinds of rules. Computer programs can embody far more general rules. The electric universe. Uncritical application of mathematical models will lead to whimsical and unstable descriptions of nature, a quote you heard from me before. All right. Views on complexity. New kind of science. Even extremely simple programs can produce behavior of immense complexity. That's what we saw in Rule 110. Everyday experience tends to make one think that it is difficult to get complex behavior, and that to do so requires complicated underlying rules. The discovery now that simple programs can produce immense complexity forces a major shift in scientific intuition. I love his choice of that word. By the way, it's from the Latin tueor, which means to look at. Intuition is just looking deeply at, right? Electric universe. Although plasma behavior follows simple or electromagnetic laws, the resulting complexity continues to astonish the specialists who study it. Plasma can self-organize into cells of differing electrical characteristics. I included that last sentence because self-organizing is another term in complexity theory, which came naturally to the pen of the authors of Electric Universe. It's part of the language we now speak, really. Views on time, the third of the 3 topics I mentioned, new kind of science. Time may have a fundamentally different nature from space. Standard mathematical formulation of relativity theory suggests that, despite our everyday impression, time should be viewed as a 4th dimension, much like space. A new kind of science suggests, however, that time as we perceive it may instead emerge from an underlying process that makes it quite different from space. Electric universe. Einstein redefined Newtonian gravity by placing it in a metaphysical framework. He combined the 3 measurable physical dimensions of space with a mathematical dimension that cannot be measured by a ruler, time. The claimed success of Einstein's thought experiments encouraged mathematicians to follow his lead, and they have dominated physics and cosmology ever since. This skeptical attitude towards what Einstein did will, I take it, warm the heart of all who attend Natural Philosophy Alliance meetings. We're going to really relax because I'm going to tell you stories, all right? To prepare the ground, here's the last sentence of A New Kind of Science, and a quote from a poet placed by the authors of The Electric Universe at the top of the 2nd page of that book. Last sentence of A New Kind of Science. All the wonders of the universe can in effect be captured by simple rules, but there can be no way to know all the consequences of these rules, except, in effect, just to watch and see how they unfold. Tueor, to watch and see. Quote quote on second page of The Electric Universe, a quote I deeply love. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. Muriel Rukeyser. By the way, I have another quote, and I think it's Whitehead, who was cited earlier. The event is the unit of things real. If that's not by Whitehead, please correct me, but it's a philosopher saying what a poet says here. Now I'm going to tell you an unpredictable story, one of the great serendipitous moments in the history of science, I like to think. Peratt's Christmas tree meets Talbot's chain of arrows. Chain of arrows. All right. This is the story. Some of you may have heard it in a simplified version. I'm privileged to have received it from the horse's mouth, Dave Talbot, in an email of this week earlier. And I asked him to tell me the story of Peratt at a meeting where he said, "What are those?" And Talbot said, "Petroglyphs." And the first version I heard of it was Peratt thought, well, these are my plasma shapes. What are they doing out there in petroglyphs? But here's Dave's telling of the story. We had invited Tony to our conference in September 2000. At a gathering of speakers the next day after the conference, Tony was inspired to go to the whiteboard and to draw some plasma images. Let's go back. There's the whiteboard. There are the plasma images. Then he drew out the chain of arrows, which he called the Christmas tree, upper left form in the attached. I said, "Tony, you've just drawn the chain of arrows, an image I directed Wall's attention to only a few days before the conference." Tony asked how the form evolved. I told him it began with twin filaments up the polar axis, dividing into a stack of embedded cones that emerged eventually as a stack of toruses called the ladder of heaven and backbone of the sky. Tony said that's how the Peratt instability evolved, the name given to the configuration by his co-workers. When he returned home, he asked me for the rock art images. And the first image I sent him was the Kayenta petroglyph, because I had no doubt he would recognize it. That was the squatter man from Kayenta, Arizona, really just across the border in northern Arizona from northern New Mexico. The moment Tony saw it, his life was changed. He had no doubt whatsoever that it was an intense plasma instability, and he immediately identified the parts for me. Dave attached this picture too. You can call these Christmas trees, arrows, or cones. They are either going up to or coming down from a red disk. That would be Mars. And his attention immediately shifted to cataloging rock art images. Numerous occasions afterwards, Tony confirmed to me that he had absolutely confirmed the formations I'd reconstructed, saying that he could also demonstrate conclusively, in due course, that they involve planets as the anodes and cathodes in the discharge configuration. That's the end of the story as Dave Talbot emailed it to me, entitling it "The Story in a Nutshell." So now the story takes on a dramatic global life. Peratt assembles a team to look at rock art all around the world and to put a GPS on each to see where it's pointing. Well, on that team is Marinus Anthony van der Sloos, aka Rens. There he is with the Great Pyramids as backdrop. There he is in Mongolia. So what does the team come up with? Well, I'm going to give you 3 examples of rock art juxtaposed to photographs by Tony. I think we're doing well on time because I'm coming to an end, and which will be familiar to many of you. And this is just to confirm that this global wandering team did indeed find rock art images corresponding to what you'll see as photographs, 3-dimensional, of Tony's figures generated in a lab, and then a schematic drawing of them. And there again, we saw this at the beginning. This is the Kayenta petroglyph, which Dave first sent to Tony. That would be the squatter man. I'm going to show you 2 more, and Tony, in his written work, says he has a total of 84 such plasma shapes in rock art. So a second would be, first, the schematic diagram of a stacked torus, and second, that image 4 miles west of here, in Petroglyph National Monument, Rinconada. Support your local petroglyph. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stacks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sometimes they're 5, sometimes they're 4. 6 is very common. And we needn't go into the details of the schematic diagram. You've seen it before, you'll probably see it again. Finally, defining image for the tipping point, the Vajra, the Hindu word for the great thunderbolt which Indra wields, and which one fine recent translator, Stanley Lombardo, used in his translation of Hesiod's Theogony for the great thunderbolt which Zeus wields. Here is the 3-dimensional photograph in Peratt's lab. Here is the tridental shape at both ends of the thunderbolt or of the trident of Poseidon. And here is the hand that grasps it of a god. My own specialty is Pindar. And in a poem, a victory ode for a young boxer from southern Italy, whose town had a lightning bolt on its coins, Pindar alludes to that coinage at the climax of the poem by speaking of Zeus's primeval victory, the pattern for all Olympic victories, where he overcame the Titans and Typhon with the bolt, as he says, grasped by the hand of fire. That is the hand of fire. The problem now for us is that Tony's story is about things that appeared in the sky that are not there now. The story is not finished until we can say how they disappeared, how they, as we might say, disintegrated, how, amping up the language, it collapsed catastrophically. That is a story Rentz has set himself to tell, and he does so purely through the language of myth around the world in the fourth of the 4 volumes of his recently published magnum opus, Traditional Cosmology, the Global Mythology of Creation and Destruction. Volume 4 is entitled, pardon the typo, Disintegration, and its subsections are disruption, disconnection, dispersion, inversion, departure, periodization, and eschaton, the last thing. So you can read that volume right now. So we return to Galileo. This is my last slide. And here Galileo is showing the Doge of Venice, his telescope. Too bad the Doge didn't use his power to keep Galileo out of the hands of the forces of the Pope and ultimately of lifelong house arrest. I'm going to summarize with 2 more quotes from A New Kind of Science. Simple computer experiments reveal a vast world of new phenomena. In their times, Wolfram goes on, telescopes revealed vast worlds that had never been seen before. Through the ideas of a new kind of science, computer experiments now also reveal a vast new world, in many ways more diverse and surprising even than the world seen in astronomy. And this from Thunderbolt to the Gods. The new data Galileo, great, lots of time. The new data Galileo collected in his first few weeks of telescopic observation overthrew the Ptolemaic view of the universe, a view accepted for more than 1,000 years. So I'm going to conclude with an anecdote from 3 weeks ago, at Bard College where I teach, and where I'm delighted to say all of the 500 freshmen in our freshman seminar are required to read not only Plato and Shakespeare, Dante and Virgil, but Galileo as the last reading. And it suddenly occurred to me in class as a way of saying that what Galileo saw and did with what he saw can be compared to something happening in the world today. And I chose Tony Peratt as an example. Galileo, I told them, made his telescope, looked through it, saw the imperfect surface of the moon, its valleys, its mountains, its ruggedness, and was compelled to tell the world of what he saw, and in so doing to overthrow the assumption by which the Western world had lived for almost 2,000 years, given it by Aristotle, consolidated by Ptolemy, namely that the moon and everything above it, the planets and the starry sphere, are perfect. They can have no irregularities either of motion or of surface. That worldview had to be overthrown. Galileo had to tell people that any of them, the Doge of Venice or you, can look through that telescope and see the imperfections of the surface of the moon. Likewise, Stephen Wolfram felt he needed to tell the world, after looking at Rule 110, that simple, that highly complex behavior, so complex that its continued evolution cannot be predicted, just has to be watched unfolding, can be generated on a computer in cellular automata. And you can see by the mode of its generation that that complexity came from very simple rules against all our intuition. Finally, Tony Peratt saw in his lab the shapes that kept morphing from one to another as he added more current. Then he saw those rock art forms, as Walt had seen from Dave 6 years earlier, and was compelled to tell the world, all 3 of them, that the sky that ancient man and woman saw, the ancient sky, was not the same as we see today. That is overthrowing a still dominant assumption. And the seers of those plasma shapes and petroglyphs have felt compelled to tell the world it was not so. The ancient sky was different. Thank you.
Likes, say, Jupiter or Saturn, because of the electrical energy coming in, it's lighting up like any of the new gas discharge electric lights that you see in car headlights and so on. So that's what we're looking at, it's just an electric light. I think the theorists have to begin to look at plasma physics, real plasma physics, the physics of electrical discharges in low pressure gases, and forget about thermonuclear models at this stage, but concentrate on plasma discharge phenomena.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Where does gravity fit in the electric universe? Contrary to a somewhat common misperception, the electric universe does not deny gravity's existence, nor its role in the cosmos and our own world. Rather, the electric universe theory, as proposed by physicist Wal Thornhill, suggests that the fundamental mysteries of gravity may be explained by the electrical structure of matter. In his 2008 article, Electric Gravity in an Electric Universe, Thornhill asks, when we apply force to a body, how is that force transferred to overcome inertia? The answer is electrically, by the repulsion between the outer electrons in the atoms closest to the points of contact. The equivalence of inertial and gravitational mass strongly suggests that the force of gravity is a manifestation of the electric force. Today, Bishop Nicholas Sykes further elaborates the query he first posed in his previous episode. What is the speed of gravity? And he elaborates the explanations for gravity that the electric universe proposes.
My last Space News video about the light-exceeding speed of gravity, titled What is the Speed of Gravity?, provoked some reactions. Someone wondered if I had never heard that gravity was not a force, but a bending of the fabric of space-time. Another argued that gravity did not need explanation because it was something that was just there.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe,
nothing can travel
brought to you
faster
by
than light, has become so entrenched that even some of us identifying with the EU model as a whole find it difficult to give fair consideration to the claim that gravity operating as a real force requiring a real explanation necessitates a real transmission far greater than the speed of light. Yet even if we are only at the beginning of providing such an explanation, it is important for the integrity of the EU model to adhere always to a simple force-based model for gravity, because gravity does, when all is said and done, manifest itself to our senses as a force. The electric universe model is constructed with explanations that invariably exclude just their formulations, which are, in effect, widely used
Welcome to
agreements
Space
to
News from
discard
the
the
Electric
need
Universe,
for
brought to
rational
you by the
explanation.
Thunderbolts Project at
As a result of such agreements,
thunderbolts.info.
the scientific
Solar
landscape
physicists
is
are
littered with
wrestling
such
with a new
follies.
mystery. Why is the sun so perfectly round? Centrifugal forces in a rotating ball of gas should make the sun wider at its equator than along its axis. But scientists working with the Solar Dynamics Observatory have obtained what they call the most accurate measurement of the sun's shape. What they have found is that the sun is far too perfectly round, forcing solar physicists to rethink their assumptions about the sun.
They found that the sun is actually much closer to a perfectly round circle than they had expected, based on their theory. Now, their theory has certain assumptions and certain models that they use to determine whether or not the rotation of the sun is going to make it swash down and get a little bit wider through the equator, much like the Earth does. But as it turns out, despite the rotation of the sun, which is a complex thing in itself, faster at the equator than at the poles, the sun is not flattening out nearly as much as their theory expected. So when there's something that goes wrong with the basics of your theory, that usually requires a little introspection and anything ranging from tweaking to trying to redo the whole thing from scratch.
This discovery joins a long string of surprises for solar physicists. Is it possible that our fundamental theories about the sun, ideas that have guided astronomers for decades, need to be reconsidered?
Most of the observations of the sun have not fit theory. This is a textbook case of falsification, and you make deductions from your theory and come up with circumstances that you should find. You go out and look for those circumstances, and when you don't find them, your theory is falsified. It seems to me we need to examine Eddington's assumption back in the 20s that the sun is internally powered. He adopted that assumption because he couldn't think of any mechanism for an external power. Now we know that the universe is composed of plasma, and from laboratory experiments we know plasma is electrically active. So that revitalizes revisiting the assumption, is the sun powered externally?
A sun powered by external electrical input could answer many puzzles of solar behavior, from the missing solar convection to temperature anomalies to acceleration of the solar wind, and many more. Since gravity is insufficient to overcome centrifugal forces on the sun, the ability of electromagnetic forces to confine plasma must now be explored to explain the sun's roundness.
The sun and almost everything we see in the universe is ionized, and it's in a state that's called plasma, the fourth state of matter that is not discussed very widely. Because it's in an ionized state, which means that electrons are stripped off the atoms and it becomes a lot more susceptible to electromagnetic forces. Usually astronomers think primarily of gravity and collision type forces as the root causes of everything that goes on, but electromagnetic forces are actually much stronger, or can be much stronger under the right circumstances, than the force of gravity. But to incorporate the forces of electromagnetism and electric currents and very chaotic magnetic fields which change over time into their model is a very difficult thing to do. In fact, the numerical simulations of plasmas are almost intractable, which means unsolvable, because they get so complex and so chaotic so quickly. As the size goes up, the scale of it goes up and everything.
There's reputations and salaries at stake on this. So there's a strong incentive to patch the theory rather than examine assumptions. There's also the cost of if you adopted a new theory, you would have to rewrite the books and change curriculums and reprogram computers. So there's a good reason for not adopting a new theory. However, that's expediency.
Well,
it's not science. And lately we've been, it seems like expediency has taken over science. We're in the dark age of science.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to Thunder. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. According to a new report, scientists are now on the verge of deciphering the mystery of dark matter. Researchers working with data from the Planck satellite have detected an intense form of radiation called synchrotron radiation from the center of the Milky Way galaxy. Scientists at the Niels Bohr Institute have interpreted these radiation emissions as evidence of dark matter. Professor Pavel Maselsky says of the discovery, "We know from theoretical predictions that the concentration of dark matter particles around the center of galaxies is very high, and we have a strong argument they can collide there, and in the collision, electrons and positrons are formed. These electrons and positrons start to rotate around the magnetic field at the center of the galaxy, and in doing so, produce this very unusual synchrotron radiation." But is this really a plausible explanation for synchrotron radiation in space?
Astrophysicists have found from observation that various results that they come up with demand that there be more matter in galaxies, for example, than they actually observe. And so they postulate dark matter to allow their results to all be explained by gravitation alone. In a sense, you could say that before it was observed, Uranus was dark matter because its position was postulated purely by gravitational theory, and then they found it. So before it was found, it was in a sense dark matter, but they're taking this to ridiculous extremes now. But it's the same sort of argument that they're using. Here we've got some results. We need more actual matter to explain them, so it must be there. It's just that we can't see it.
You can't see dark matter. Dark matter is invisible, and it's invented to save the theory. So wherever they see something that doesn't fit the theory, they can always put some dark matter there, and then it'll make the theory fit what they see. So dark matter is kind of a blank check. that they can write whenever the theory fails, they can write a check for dark matter, and then they'll say, oh, this proves it. There's a circularity to it, that we prove the existence of dark matter because we assumed it was where it needed to be.
Emissions of synchrotron radiation have long posed an unsolved mystery for mainstream astrophysicists. The mystery resides in the spectacular acceleration of charged particles, beyond anything astronomers had anticipated in space.
Synchrotron radiation is basically radiation that's given off by charged particles that are spiraling in a magnetic field. And technically, it refers to X-rays from particles that are moving near the speed of light. But if you have particles that are moving much less than the speed of light, they still give off radiation. It's just at the lower energy level. So it's radio instead of X-ray. The problem that astrophysicists have is that they have this taboo against electricity in space. And so in order to get the charged particles to spiral in the magnetic fields, they have to do it with some mechanical means, which is usually collisions. So metaphorically, they bang rocks together to get electricity. If it were up to them, I guess they would light street lights by falling rocks. Astrophysicists mostly just ignore the synchrotron radiation. Once in a while, they'll admit it, like this time when, oh, there's synchrotron radiation at the core of the Milky Way. Wonder how many rocks we have to bang together to get that.
The discovery of synchrotron radiation fulfilled the prediction of plasma physicist Hannes Alfvén as early as 1950. Alfvén claimed that electric currents moving inward along the arms of the Milky Way would generate stupendous electric discharge, and synchrotron radiation would be its defining signature.
Alfvén's first insight back in, I guess, in the 20s was that plasma responds to magnetic fields. And he had this idea that if you have a perfect conductor, the magnetic field will become frozen into it. And so astronomers assume that any plasma in space will be a perfect conductor and the magnetic field is frozen in, and any charge separation will be immediately canceled when the charges come back together. So you can't have sustained electric fields in space. Well, Alfvén repudiated that. His further experiments showed that plasma isn't a perfect conductor and that it has a small resistance and that it does sustain electric fields. The experiments since then and in space have shown that plasma is extensively electrically active. Especially if you have two clouds of plasma moving relative to each other, they will induce electric fields and electric currents in each other. So then you get all the effects of electrified plasma, the Birkeland currents and filamentation, magnetic fields, double layers, and especially acceleration of charged particles and synchrotron radiation.
The electromagnetic effects in the universe have got to be brought to the forefront in the researches of all astrophysicists. They've got to be alongside gravitation, if you like. They've got to realize that, yes, gravitation accounts for a lot and tells us a lot, but what about these electromagnetic forces? These ideas have been around. We've got the work of Birkeland, followed up by Alfvén, and then again in more modern times by Anthony Peratt, where they've got all this theory, they've got all these experiments to back it up. Not mathematical theory, just they've got experiments to back it up. This stuff has to come through. I'm not saying gravitation doesn't have a role to play, but they're not going to explain things if they don't bring in the electromagnetic force.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. For many years, astronomers have expressed confidence in their understanding of the origins of the universe. Today, most astronomers agree that a primordial creation event
called the Big Bang gave birth to the universe precisely 13.7 billion years ago. But a new scientific study is one of many findings that raise significant questions about this theory. Researchers using the Hubble telescope have spotted an astounding spiral galaxy. Astounding, they say, because it shouldn't exist. The researchers have dated the galaxy's age at 10.7 billion years old. Lead author of the study, David Law, says of these findings, the fact that this galaxy exists is astounding. Current wisdom holds that such grand design spiral galaxies simply didn't exist at such an early time in the history of the universe. What are we to make of these and other findings that defy the underpinnings of the Big Bang theory?
Standard theories dictate the faster an object recedes from Earth, the farther away it is, because the primordial Big Bang explosion is supposed to have imparted an initial push that's causing the universe to expand. Using those theoretical parameters, a faster recessional velocity means greater distance, which means an earlier time period in the universe. And since an object almost 11 billion light years away is from the so-called early days of the universe, it shouldn't exhibit such complexity of form because there wasn't enough time since the Big Bang for that complexity to evolve.
Astronomers are surprised to find a high redshift galaxy with spiral structure. It has a redshift of 2.18, and most galaxies with that high of a redshift have irregular shapes. This one has well-defined arms, and it even has a companion at the end of one of them. The Big Bang theory assumes that redshift is an indicator of distance, which would put this galaxy at about 11 billion light years away. If it's that far away, it's therefore large and bright. But modern astronomy dismissed the observations of many astronomers in the last half of the 20th century, astronomers like Halton Arp and the Burbages. They found that high redshift objects tend to cluster around nearby low redshift objects. They found many physical connections, and they even found some high redshift objects in front of low redshift objects. These observations were misrepresented, and the misrepresentations were disproved. So with that excuse, the observations were dismissed and the Big Bang theory was saved. This is kind of a new scientific method. Instead of observation theory and testing, the data is judged by its conformity with belief. If it doesn't conform, then there's something wrong with the data, and the data is dismissed. In this case, fervency of belief replaces testing. If redshift is not proportional to distance, then the universe is not expanding, and there's no Big Bang.
Scientists in the electric universe community suspect that high redshift is intrinsic to the plasma environment of a young or newborn galaxy.
This galaxy is likely nearby, small, and faint. In the electric universe hypothesis, high redshift is an indicator of youth and being highly charged. High redshift objects are born by electrical injection from older galaxies. So the companion at the end of the arm indicates that this galaxy has had recent ejection activity. It's an active galaxy, and active galaxies are usually spiral. So in the electric universe hypothesis, this object isn't surprising at all. It's expected.
The same electric force responsible for a galaxy's redshift may also give rise to its spiraling structure and other features such as polar jets.
One of the most significant contributors, I would say, to plasma cosmology and the electric universe theory was Dr. Anthony Peratt, a plasma physicist. And he was a protege of Hans Alfvén, the famous Nobel laureate. And Peratt studied plasma formations in the laboratory for many years. And what he did was create what are called particle and cell animations on supercomputers. Galaxies are, rather than being condensations of gas and dust that are gravitationally bound together, were actually plasma formations. And he thought that these simulations showed that cosmic plasma is confined due to self-consistent magnetic fields. And these magnetic fields are induced by currents that are flowing through the plasma, creating filamentary structures. And a cross section through these filamentary structures indicated the formation of several galaxy configurations. And among those configurations were elliptical and barred spiral shapes. So Peratt insisted that plasma, along with electricity, engenders the structures in the universe. And since galaxies are often strung like pearls through space, or like beads on a string, that galactic arrangement lends credence to that idea.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In this special abbreviated edition, we flash back to January 2005, when something remarkable happened on the Sun. Over a period of 5 days, 4 powerful solar flares erupted from sunspot 720, followed by a coronal mass ejection that achieved velocities incomparably greater than anything astronomers had seen before. While it usually takes more than 24 hours for the charged particles of a solar outburst to reach the Earth, this one was a profound exception. Just 30 minutes after the explosion, Earth, some 96 million miles from the Sun, was immersed in what NASA scientists called the most intense proton storm in decades. Shortly thereafter, a NASA news release stated that the event has shaken the foundations of space weather theory. How could the material from a coronal mass ejection achieve such unthinkable velocity? In fact, even the more standard acceleration of CME charged particles away from the Sun remains unexplained by solar physicists, a problem that only underscores the mystery surrounding the 2005 eruption. Based on the sunspot's location, one astrophysicist noted that the storm's path followed the lines of force of the Sun's magnetic field, leading directly to Earth. A NASA headline described this connection as a superhighway for protons leading all the way from sunspot 720 to our planet. However, this same article concluded how they were accelerated remains a mystery. But proponents of the electric universe insist that the event in question is not mysterious at all. Many decades ago, plasma physicist Hannes Alfvén documented the phenomenon called field-aligned currents, in which electric currents move efficiently following the direction of induced magnetic fields. Throughout the universe, across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, we see plasma jets and ejected material often attaining velocities approaching the speed of light. In electrical terms, the explanation seems obvious. Electric fields in space accelerate charged particles. Only electric fields are known to accelerate charged particles to these extreme velocities. In the electric model of the Sun, as illuminated by Professor Don Scott, the surface of the Sun acts in the fashion of a transistor, such that small changes in electric current can produce large variables in the Sun's behavior. All such interpretation requires that the Sun stand at the center of an electric field. This would mean that all of the planets and moons within the Sun's electric domain are swimming in electric currents. From the Earth's own blue sprites and red jets blasting into space, to the electrified dust devils and global dust storms on Mars, to the hot poles and electrified geysers of Saturn's moon Enceladus, and even the explosive activities of comets in response to solar outbursts, and much, much more. As we continue our discussion of the electric sun and the electric universe theory, we seek to shed new light on the countless mysteries that may finally only be resolved by a reconsideration of the role of electricity in space. For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A team of astronomers is claiming to have observed an object whose existence shatters the underpinnings of the Big Bang Theory. The quasar group, called Huge LQG, is supposedly so enormous it would comprise roughly 5% of the observable universe.
What?
By conventional reasoning, an object of this size simply could not have formed since the theoretical Big Bang explosion. According to lead author Dr. Roger Close, the finding upsets the foundation of everything we do. But as is so often the case with baffling space discoveries, are we being told the complete story?
The question that arises from this recent finding of a gigantic quasar cluster, which, according to the headline, shatters long-held theories of space, is that it actually shatters the long-held theory of the Big Bang. But that's not specified. It's just put in general terms because, of course, there is no alternative to the Big Bang Theory at present, or at least there isn't, according to conventional science. Of course, the electric universe sees all of this as being confirmation of Helton Arp's work of decades ago, where he actually predicted that these highly redshifted objects, the quasars, would appear to be larger and larger and brighter the higher the redshift, simply because of this idea that the redshift is a measure of the distance. Now, Helton Arp has shown, and the electric universe actually expects, that quasars are merely faint because they're young. They're just been recently hatched, so to speak, from a parent galaxy, and they're highly redshifted. But they are born from nearby galaxies, so these things are much closer than the 9 billion light years that is specified in the article.
This large quasar group, they call it the Huge Quasar Group. It's almost 9 billion light years away. That's if the distance is proportional to redshift assumption that they make is true. It's 4 billion light years long. The press release says it would take 4 billion years to cross it, which makes it sound like it's more or less spherical. But actually, it's only 1 billion light years wide. It's actually a filament. The paper that reports on it says discreetly that it's substantially elongated. That's quite a bit elongated. It covers 20 degrees of the sky. You could put 40 full moons side by side along the length of it. Of course, it's thin. It's not anywhere near spherical. The sizes come from the assumption that the distance is proportional to its redshift. Its redshift is 1.27, and the magnitudes of the quasars in it range from 18 to 19. There could be some fainter ones because the survey arbitrarily cut off at 19. It lies 25 degrees west of the Virgo cluster, and the magnitude range of the objects in it are similar to the Z=1 quasars that Helton Arp is associated with the Virgo cluster. It overlies 3 Messier galaxies, M95, M96, and M105, which are a little bit closer than the Virgo cluster, according to the standard reckoning. So it's kind of on the fringes of the Virgo cluster. And my first guess is that these quasars are actually ejections from these Messier galaxies at the edge of Virgo. So if they're at the conventional distance of the Virgo cluster, then this huge group is only 20 million light years long instead of 4 billion. It's 200 times closer than what they think it is, and it's only 0.5% as big as they think it is. The result of the distance is proportional to redshift assumption is that astronomers are looking at gnats swarming around their heads and thinking that they see fleets of 747s on the horizon. The observational evidence that undermines the distance is proportional to redshift assumption has been known since the 1980s from the work of Paul Narp, who noticed that these high redshift quasars had a statistical and oftentimes a physical association with nearby active galaxies. Standard astronomers have ignored this evidence, and they've backed themselves into not just a corner, but a very long dead end. If redshift is not primarily a measure of distance, then the expanding universe and the Big Bang cosmology are obsolete.
The astronomers' observations of huge LQG also challenge the cosmological principle, which theorizes that the universe is homogeneous or the same in all directions.
The cosmological principle actually goes back to Newton. It's the assumption, again, there's that assumption, that we don't occupy a unique place in the universe, that at sufficiently large scales, the universe will look the same from every point within it. So if this holds up, this would mean that at the largest scale, the universe is not homogeneous, that this clump of matter couldn't have developed from gravity since the Big Bang.
Notably absent from media coverage of huge LQG is any meaningful discussion of the predictive success of the astronomer Halton Arp.
It really is scandalous that Halton Arp, a noted astronomer of his day, who predicted that this kind of observation would be made, is not even mentioned in the article. And in fact, I've seen no comment anywhere in the news items at all about Halton Arp's work, which predicted this kind of finding. You would expect that a finding which goes against what is generally believed and something that is predicted would be headline news, and that Halton Arp should be singled out for recognition. Instead of that, we see nothing, silence, and there's waffling about long-held theories of space without saying that the Big Bang theory has actually been disproven.
Waffling.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. Science headlines around the world tell us almost daily about astronomers' observations of black holes in deep space. These headlines imply that the existence of black holes is no longer in doubt, but not every story suggests that all is well with black hole theory. Recently, astronomers using the VLA telescope made a surprising discovery. They observed two bright radio spots in the globular cluster M22, which they interpret as proof of two small black holes. However, standard theory dictates that only one black hole at most should be present in the cluster. The National Radio Astronomy Observatory reports of these findings. Simulations have indicated that these black holes would fall toward the center of the cluster, then begin a violent gravitational dance with each other, in which all of them, or perhaps all but a single one, would be thrown completely out of the cluster. But as is often the case in media discussions of black holes, are we really seeing the complete story?
It's felt that really all but one of these black holes are expected to be ejected from the cluster through various kinds of dynamical interaction, even though, as they point out, perhaps hundreds of these may be formed originally when the globular cluster is condensed. They also note a relative lack of black hole binaries in different kinds of globular clusters that have been observed. But let's just back up a little bit and be clear about what's really being observed here. The way the paper is reported, and even the way the original journal article is written, the things being observed are labeled unequivocally black holes. But what is really being observed is a couple bright radio spots in the sky. In this case, it was two relatively bright radio spots. That's it. What is inferred from that is that each of those radio spots is a binary with a black hole and another star, with the other star feeding the black hole hot gas, which is accelerated and superheated to the extent that it emits, in this case, radio, but more often than not, they're talking about X-rays, that they'll see a bright X-ray spot with an X-ray observatory, and what's inferred is that's a black hole that's emitting X-rays, but we don't see a black hole. We don't see an accretion disk, which is apparently emitting the various kinds of radiation. We don't even see a binary. What we see is an energy source, a dot, basically, against a darker background of the same energy. So in this case, the authors see these two radio sources in M22 and propose that there are two black holes of what's called stellar mass, about 10 to 20 times that of our sun. After that initial proposal in the paper, it's then taken as fact that we're looking at black holes.
Also missing from media coverage is an historical perspective on the evolution of black hole theory in response to surprising discoveries in space.
What's interesting is the way that this accretion disk model has evolved. On one hand, there was mathematical abstraction of a black hole, which attracted mathematical physicists because of the elegant way in which the field equations, in which Einstein's field equations could be solved. And there was an increasing complexity of the boundary conditions that were allowed around the field equations to create different hypothetical versions of black holes. And you can read this in the history of black holes and how those boundary conditions were enhanced. And then at the same time, observations of highly energetic events that were being increasingly seen because the kinds of devices, the kinds of observatories and the number of observatories and the frequencies that we were allowed to see at, and radio and UV and X-rays and gamma rays, it's difficult to assign an engine to drive them. And in a cosmological framework that really uses only gravity to explain how things work, being able to take the mathematical abstraction that had been sort of evolving in parallel, that was the tool in the toolbox that came to hand. It was very clever, the construct that was created around these binaries that cannot be seen, the accretion disks that cannot be observed. But what I find worrying is the way that it's adopted now is the only explanation. It worries me that any time an X-ray source is observed, it's a black hole. So that the media and the general public are left with the feeling that we are directly observing black holes all the time. It's not the case. We're observing very high energy, very distant high energy events, like X-ray flickers in our observatories. They're not black holes. There are unexpected and variable radiation sources, sudden flashes of gamma rays or sudden flashes of X-rays that coincide with optical emissions at the same time. And it usually results in very convoluted explanations involving a binary accretion disk, gases that are being dammed up somehow and then allowed to flow and accelerate to create these flashes of energy. Whereas these kinds of intense and periodic or variable energetic events can be observed with plasma behavior quite commonly in the lab or at different scales.
For decades, scientists working with electrified plasmas in the laboratory have succeeded in reproducing both high energy emissions and extraordinary structure that we now observe in space across the entire electromagnetic spectrum.
For a long time, the idea of electrical currents in space was sort of poo-pooed, but now we know it's quite common. The space between the Earth and the Sun is known to have huge plasma filaments of electrical current, creating large ropes of magnetic fields. So if we're forced to accept electrical currents in our solar system, is it not possible to accept large-scale electric currents, and even more so, accept large-scale high-energy electrical events? Gravity is very, very weak. To achieve these energy densities with a gravity-driven engine, you need supermassive and super dense objects to make it all work. You can create very high energy plasma events in the lab. Exploding double layers, arcing, etc., output gamma rays, X-rays, and so on. These are high energy electrical events you can create in the lab and scale. You cannot create a black hole and an accretion disk in the lab, but you can sure create these electrical plasma phenomenon, and they scale it very nicely to these kinds of galactic and stellar sizes. So my feeling is, why go so exotic and sci-fi with black holes and event horizons and so forth? Occam's razor dictates we accept a simpler, falsifiable explanation.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. How old and how stable is our solar system? On this question, astronomers have grown more uncertain year by year. The actual history of the planets could be a far cry from anything we learned in school. Here is our reporter, Cameron Mercer, with excerpts from his conversation with the electrical theorist Wal Thornhill.
We have always lived in a very interesting solar system. However, we have never been able to pin down just how interesting it is. First, it was entirely special, with no equal anywhere else. Then, a century ago, sentiment gradually shifted and people started to understand our solar system as a common occurrence. There were bound to be other solar systems out there, just like ours, waiting to be found. Less than 2 decades ago, we started making our first observations of other solar systems, and the more we find, the stranger ours seems to be.
The solar system has actually been described as weird when compared to planetary systems around nearby stars. We seem to have the gas giants much further away from the sun than similar planets are around nearby stars. Around nearby stars, those giant planets orbit very closely to their star. And the answer to this problem is another ad hoc addition to the theory of how the solar system formed, and that is that the giant planets were not formed where we see them now. They must have migrated, because all of the exoplanets that we've discovered are large planets, even larger than Jupiter, orbiting the central star in days or even hours in some cases. So these systems of planets are quite different to anything that we see in our own solar system. This raises the issue of how exactly did our solar system form, and why are our gas giants so far from the sun?
As straightforward a question as this seems, this is actually proven very difficult to answer. Astronomers quickly learned that the general theory of solar system formation couldn't work for our own solar system, since it postulates that planets form in more or less their current orbits. Uranus and Neptune are far out, too far out to have formed where they are today. So in 2005, some French astronomers came up with a brilliant idea. What if the planets' orbits could move? Maybe then they could migrate from some earlier state to the improbable arrangement we see now. This idea had been entirely untested until recently.
In 2005, Nature magazine published a paper which has become known as the Nice paper because it came from France. And that paper was trying to find the early states of the solar system and finding that nothing worked for Uranus and Neptune, the outermost gas giants. The gas giants simply couldn't have formed at a great distance because it takes far too much time for them to have accreted from a cloud of dust and gas. So the Nice model was proposed, which supposes the gas giants formed in close where they are more likely to form. Now, this recent paper is the first simulation of the Nice model, and it's tried to simulate changes which could produce Uranus and Neptune at their present distances.
It appears it is once again that time. Well, all I know about nothing with the credits. Not sure, like that. You get through extra and wait and hear them. Right, chaps. I've got no idea. Nice. 40,000 volts. Bigger gap. Bear with us, chaps. 200,000 volts.
200,000 volts.
I'm going to stick everything through it. I'm going to press every button on this panel, leave the room, and I'll leave you guys with it, because something is going to give way.
He's leaving the room.
They won't last long.
what's so crazy was doing to the air.
I don't think there's any gas in them anymore. Get that glass back in.
It cooled off a piece of glass snapped.
I quite enjoyed that.
Fell in there.
Gas in there looks rather nasty. It's not looking good, is it?
Couldn't it just as easily have shown that to us by sliding it across the globe, the sphere? Charge station. That's why my phone battery never dies.
Jay here. Welcome back to Plasma Channel. I've received many requests for episode topics, and I gotta say, they're all pretty awesome. But one that stood out that I think you guys would benefit a lot from is how to make your own high voltage power supply. In fact, it's going to be really similar to the power source that I've been using this whole time. So get yourself ready for a 5-minute build. We're gonna build, ow, So our methodology is going to be quite simple, and this build is going to be so easy that I don't know if we can even call it a build. But But we're going to need two things.
I'll have to watch that on my own time. Hey, that's my channel.
And also Jupiter and Saturn in their present far-flung orbits from the Sun. The simulations of the NEACE model show that Uranus and Neptune remain a problem. We still cannot make a planetary system that looks like our solar system, theoretically.
David Nesperny of the Colorado Southwest Research Institute ran over 6,000 simulations of the NEACE model in his search for a viable early stage of the solar system. He had 4 target criteria that, if met, would qualify the simulation as a potential early state of the solar system.
In only 2.5% of cases were they able to satisfy just the first 2 criteria out of 4. This is a huge problem for the current theory of solar system formation. It means the early solar system could not have looked like it does now, with Neptune and Uranus in the outer reaches. The paper concludes with the formation of Uranus and Neptune, the outermost gas giants, and say that it's a long-standing problem in planetary science. And the paper finishes with future work will be needed to address these issues.
Astronomers are heading down the right path, starting first with a theory of static formation, which hadn't the slightest hope of forming our system. They proceeded to then consider planetary migration. David Nesperny took this yet a step further and considered planetary ejection, in which case he found his chances of producing our current solar system increased almost tenfold over the NEACE model.
It seemed certain that the solar system required rearrangement of the planets to explain their present placing and characteristics. The NEACE model wasn't enough, just rearranging planets, so the next thing was ejection. But that also hasn't been enough. Did something more dramatic occur to produce the solar system we see today? In all of the theoretical work that has taken place, we have assumed that all of the matter that's in the solar system right now began there. No one, except in the very early days, considered capture of objects from beyond the solar system. There was a good reason for this. To do so, the object coming into the solar system has to lose energy, and gravity doesn't offer any simple way of doing that. In the electric universe, there is electrical exchange which can take place, and capture is very much more likely than it is in the gravitational model. So the very fact that we do have gas giants like Neptune and Uranus at distances from the Sun where they could not have accreted suggests that they were captured. Not only that, the motion of Pluto and some of the outer moons do suggest capture rather than having been formed in place.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A new paper published by an MIT physicist claims to theoretically prove that so-called quantum entanglement, or two particles each seemingly occupying multiple states simultaneously, gives rise to a wormhole, which allows particles to communicate through a so-called gravitational tunnel. This theory follows from a paper published earlier this year, which suggests that when two black holes become entangled, then are pulled apart, a wormhole is created which connects the black holes. The reasoning in these papers follows from a purely mathematical approach to physics and cosmology. In this two-part presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill examines just how reliable this approach is at describing how the universe actually works.
A glaring example of the irrational is to be seen in a recent Science Daily report titled, "You Can't Get Entangled Without a Wormhole," which refers to papers by Julian Sonner, a senior postdoc in MIT's Lab for Nuclear Science and Center for Theoretical Physics, and a related paper by Kristen Jensen of the University of Victoria and Andreas Karsch of the University of Washington. The article says that essentially entanglement involves two particles, each occupying multiple states at once. a condition referred to as superposition. For example, both particles may simultaneously spin clockwise and counterclockwise, but neither has a definite state until one is measured, causing the other particle to instantly assume a corresponding state. The resulting correlations between the particles are preserved even if they reside on opposite ends of the universe. End of quote. Now, the word entanglement is a euphemism to hide the fact that the physical connection is unknown. So all that follows isn't physics, it's mystification. The indeterminacy of states also means we are not dealing with physics, which relies on being able to determine the state of the system being observed. From a real physicist's point of view, the most telling experimental fact is that the connection between two entangled particles is instantaneous, even if they reside on opposite ends of the universe. So the article asks the question, but what enables particles to communicate instantaneously and seemingly faster than the speed of light over such distances? The simple classical physics answer is that the connection between the two particles is not via a slow transverse electromagnetic wave. Instead, it's the same kind of connection that we observe between the planets and the sun. That is, gravity. Newton's law of gravity does not include time. The force of gravity acts instantaneously. Now, the electric universe explains that gravity itself is a form of the electric force that operates upon neutral bodies by distorting the subatomic charged particles within those bodies to form tiny, weak electric dipoles. This simple model explains why gravity is such a weak force, because subatomic particles are infinitesimally small, and also why you can't easily shield from gravity, because all of the subatomic particles participate, whether it's a conductor or a non-conductor, whatever it's made from. Importantly, though, gravity on the cosmic scale allows us to see that the direct electric force between particles operates instantly. The spookiness and non-locality of quantum phenomena can be understood both physically and in meaningful language. Entanglement, then, is simply an electrical resonance between two subatomic particles, each comprised of an identical resonance system of orbiting charged subparticles. In other words, it's a repeated pattern, like an atom within an atom. The instantaneous connection maintains the resonance or entanglement between the particles regardless of their relative movement or distance apart. Because the connection is instantaneous, there is no Doppler shift detuning or anything like that. The two particles remain in communication. This model that separates the phenomenon of electromagnetic waves in a medium from the direct longitudinal connection between all matter in the universe, that is the electrical connection, opens up new insights for physicists. For example, physicists attempt to isolate their experiment from outside influences, including the observer. But in our electric universe, there is no isolated system. The observer is a part of the experiment, whether he likes it or not, and as discovered in so-called weird quantum experiments. Contrast this simple explanation with the meaningless language of the report, and I quote, "Earlier this year, physicists proposed an answer in the form of wormholes or gravitational tunnels. The group showed that by creating two entangled black holes, then pulling them apart, they formed a wormhole, essentially a shortcut through the universe, connecting the distant black holes. Now, black holes are a mathematical mistake equivalent to the school mathematics howler of dividing by zero to get infinity. Gravity is weaker than the electric force by a factor of 1,000 billion times. Now, that's as close to zero as you can get. So using gravity to explain the concentrated energy sources observed at the centers of galaxies and calling them black holes is bound to give you answers that make no physical sense. The wormholes are a geometric construct in more than 3 dimensions, so they have nothing to do with the real space that physicists, engineers, and you and I have to deal with." But the article continues. "Now an MIT physicist has found that, looking through the lens of string theory, the creation of two entangled quarks, the building blocks of matter, simultaneously give rise to a wormhole connecting the pair." That's the end of the quote. But string theory is, according to Peter Woit, not even wrong. The questions that need to be answered by this piece of whimsy are both endless and pointless. Pointless because no one knows what a quark is, nor how matter can warp space to form a hole across the universe, or even what that means. nor how that effect can be instantaneous. Space is merely a concept of location in 3 dimensions. How do you warp a concept? But the article goes on. The theoretical results bolster the relatively new and exciting idea that the laws of gravity holding together the universe may not be fundamental, but arise from something else. Quantum entanglement. That's hardly a breakthrough when you don't understand quantum entanglement. You'll notice that modern physics is in the business of complicating things beyond comprehension, inventing new particles and forces in the hope of a Nobel Prize. It is not the way classical physics was done. Classical physics, until the beginning of the 20th century, was in the business of simplifying particles and forces. There was a strong intuitive feel on the part of leading scientists then that gravity is simply an electrical force of some description, like the forces between atoms that form our Earth and everything on it. That's the conclusion of the electric universe based on all the new evidence since then. The article says, of course, there appears to be a major barrier to reconciling quantum mechanics and general relativity. For years, physicists have tried to come up with a theory of quantum gravity to marry the 2 fields. You'll notice that the standard picture of a black hole or a gravitational object in space is represented as a funnel in space-time, usually with an object like, in the Earth's case, the moon perched on the edge of the funnel, with the idea being that the moon, instead of traversing a straight line in space, follows the curve of the funnel. However, the very image itself gives a false picture because we just assume that this gravitational well or funnel has gravity pulling from underneath to draw the object down into the funnel. But this is using gravity to explain gravity. It's a circular argument, and the image is quite misleading. An object perched on the surface of this funnel, if gravity were not pulling it down, would remain fixed on that funnel. It would have no force tending to move it downwards or sideways or upwards. It would remain exactly where it is. But it's plain to see that general relativity never explained gravity. It merely described its effect in a geometry that has no reality. And quantum mechanics is a recipe book with no understanding of the ingredients or how they interact. As a result, the rest of the article is appalling nonsense headlined, Tunneling to the 5th Dimension. It's only necessary to highlight the meaningless language to show the ideas expressed are imaginary. For example, 2 entangled black holes forgets that the mathematics of black hole theory allows only a single black hole in an empty universe. The Newtonian principle of superposition of gravitating objects doesn't apply to general relativity. There can never be a second black hole to get entangled. The theorists invoke a wormhole, a tunnel through space-time, produced by pulling 2 black holes apart. Hyphenating the words space and time to produce a 4th dimension is physically meaningless. Mathematicians use the word dimension to mean a degree of freedom in their equations. There are only 3 physical dimensions in space, which are measured by length and direction. Time has no length or direction. You can't point in the direction of time. Time has no arrow. Joining space and time has no physical significance. So you cannot produce physical wormholes in space. It is pure science fiction. One of the authors, Sonner, applied this thinking to quarks, the theoretical subatomic building blocks of matter. And I quote, "To see what emerges from 2 entangled quarks, he first generated quarks using the Schwinger effect, a concept in quantum theory that enables one to create particles out of nothing." End of quote. Here we see mathematicians resorting to dismissal of a principle of physics that you cannot perform a creation miracle. It's not scientific. The author Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy parodied this sleight of hand mercilessly when Zaphod Beeblebrock used an infinite improbability drive to rescue Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent in deep space. Particle physicists have been using the infinite improbability principle since the inception of quantum theory. As is well known, Einstein hated the idea. He's reported to have said, "God doesn't throw dice." He was right. As soon as you disconnect cause from effect, you are not doing science. Another quote from the article, Sonner mapped the entangled quarks onto a 4-dimensional space, considered a representation of space-time. In contrast, gravity is thought to exist in the next dimension as, according to Einstein's laws, it acts to bend and shape space-time, thereby existing in the 5th dimension. End of quote. There is no four-dimensional space. There is no physical fifth dimension. Gravity is not explained by general relativity. It is merely described in a limited and unreal geometric way. It is not shown how imaginary four-dimensional space can be warped. Cause and effect are disconnected. It just ain't science. It's merely mathematics. The article finally leaves all common sense and logic far behind. And I quote, "To see what geometry may emerge in the fifth dimension from entangled quarks in the fourth, Sonner employed holographic duality, a concept in string theory. While a hologram is a two-dimensional object, it contains all the information necessary to represent a three-dimensional view. Essentially, holographic duality is a way to derive a more complex dimension from the next lowest dimension." End of quote. This is total rubbish. There is no two-dimensional object. All objects are three-dimensional, so there can be no information held in two dimensions. Real objects and information can only occupy three dimensions. Coming back to the Space News report, the black hole is an alleged product of Einstein's theory of gravitation, but so is the wormhole between the two supposed black holes. It's known as an Einstein-Rosen bridge. But then the wormhole is used and related to the two black holes to define gravitation. Gravity emerges from the more fundamental phenomenon of entangled black holes, the article says. But this argument is simply a circular argument, and so it is nonsense.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info. Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. A newly discovered exoplanet poses a radical challenge to the consensus theory of planet and star formation. The massive exoplanet is 11 times the size of Jupiter, yet it circles its parent star at a distance that is 650 times the average distance between the Earth and the Sun. In the conventional theory, which imagines stars and planets forming gravitationally in a collapsing cloud of gas and dust, such a giant planet cannot form at such a vast distance from its star. Lead investigator Vanessa Bailey states, "This system is especially fascinating because no model of either planet or star formation fully explains what we see." What does the electric universe theory of planet and star formation tell us about this new discovery?
This discovery doesn't match what astronomers expected to see, for the simple reason that the expectations are based on a model which is centuries old and has never been challenged. In fact, we have another situation rather like that of the flat Earth, where data to the contrary piles up but is not accepted because everyone just knows that the Earth is flat. In the same way, astronomers believe that the planets are formed in a flat disk about a star. But it's been known for decades now, and in fact it was predicted by plasma physicists, those who have indulged in what's known as plasma cosmology, that stars are formed in the equivalent of a cosmic lightning bolt in a molecular cloud. And with the latest infrared telescopes in space and on the ground, it's been possible to actually photograph these stars in infrared, and they are strung like bright beads on a glowing string. So if this is the way condensed bodies are formed, it has nothing to do with a gravitational collapse from a clump of gas and dust. So that all models which attempt to try and explain a system like this one, where we have an 11 Jupiter-sized planet orbiting at 650 times the distance of the Earth from the Sun, you should compare this with Neptune, which is only 30 times the distance of the Earth from the Sun, and that's now our outermost planet in our solar system. So 650 times away, it took some time before it was shown that the planet actually was associated with this particular star. But of course, the problem of forming Neptune has never been answered. How do we form a gas giant at 30 times the distance of the Earth from the Sun? And now we have a planet which is 11 times the size of Jupiter being formed at 650 times the distance of the Earth from the Sun.
An alternative theory considered by mainstream scientists is that distant giant planets may form in a manner comparable to a binary star system. However, the mass ratio between the giant exoplanet and its parent star is more than 10 times too great for this theory to work. Lead investigator Vanessa Bailey states, this extreme mass ratio is not predicted from binary star formation theories, just like planet formation theory predicts that we cannot form planets so far from the host star.
Of course, it was suggested that the 11 times Jupiter-sized planet was a kind of failed binary star, but according to astronomers, the mass ratio of two stars in a binary system is typically no more than 10 to 1. In this case, it's about 100 to 1. And this extreme mass ratio is not predicted from binary star formation theories, just like planet formation theory predicts we cannot form planets so far from the host star. One of the problems that astronomers face is that they are using gravity alone to try and explain orbiting systems in space. And without any real understanding of gravity, this is bound to lead to contradictions and discoveries like the one we have here. In the electrical formation model of stars, smaller objects will also be formed along that cosmic lightning bolt. And when they are formed, some of them will be sufficiently close to each other that once the lightning more or less subsides and fades, the two objects will be gravitationally attracted towards one another. The other problem that gravitational theory faces, though, is that capture is a very unlikely process, because if two bodies swing past one another, unless there is a loss of energy between the two, motional energy, then the body passing nearby will merely swing past and then off into deep space. So there has to be something else going on, and capture must be more prevalent than gravitational theory at present can allow. Now, one of the breakthrough ideas in the electric universe model is that gravity itself is a form of dipolar electric force which is dependent upon the charge distribution inside a star. And if there is any exchange of charge at the surface of that star, that will change the gravitational force between two objects. And in fact, it is a means of achieving capture, because you're exchanging electrical energy for motional energy. That is, the trajectory of the star coming past another star will be altered in such a way that capture is more certain. Now, the formation of binary systems would seem to follow naturally from the formation nearby in a cosmic lightning bolt. But as I said, objects of different sizes, including the sizes of gas giants, will also be formed in that cosmic lightning bolt, so that capture of an object 11 times the size of Jupiter at a distance of 650 times the Earth-Sun distance from a star is far more likely and is explicable. It's even predictable. I wish to emphasize that there is more than one way to form a planetary system electrically. A common alternative is for a star to electrically eject matter in a nova outburst to form a so-called hot Jupiter. The discovery of hot